Hello and welcome to Australia Wide. I'm Letitia Lemke. On the show this week, we venture into the Highland swamps.
1, 2, 3. No, no snake. I don't see a snake. I do see something very cute though. I'm in love with swamps.
One man's quest to help the child soldiers of South Sudan.
One of the most positive things for us has been that around 1,755 children were released by one of the armed groups. And that was a result of a long process of advocacy and negotiation.
And rock and robes, the roadie turned reverend.
Occasionally still get to play guitar, although guitar and robes is not a good look unless you're going for Queen 1975.
But first, from crime to creativity, an Indigenous prisoners' art program has proven so successful there are plans to expand it across the country. Aboriginal people are overrepresented in the prison population and are statistically more likely to reoffend. But the Torch program is making a big difference, helping inmates rediscover their roots and reset their lives. Stephanie Anderson reports.
I used to say to the officers there that it's a wonder they hadn't have charged me for escape. And when I actually mentioned that word escape, you know, they kind of looked at me strange and said, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, you know, every time when I pick the brush up and start painting and that, I'm not here anymore. I'm not in the jail. I'm actually in there, you know, down the river and fishing and hunting and doing all those good things. So it was an escape.
Confined is an exhibition showing not only art, but rehabilitation and reform.
It's quite unusual. Most of the works have been made within the prison environment, either in a prison cell or within an educational room in a prison.
The Torch works with Aboriginal inmates at prisons across Victoria, helping them to reconnect with their culture through art.
This is a place from memory. This is the Serpentine River where for generations my family and I have you know, this river has sustained in my mob for years.
Angus Abdullah exhibited in Confined 4, 5 and 6 as a prisoner, but he's in the 7th show as a free man.
My name's getting out there now. I'm beginning to become known in the art world, you know, as a pretty good painter. I don't want to sound like I'm pumping up my own tyres, but you know, I reckon I'm all right.
Ray, tell me about what being in the Torch has meant to you.
It's absolutely put me on the path to a better life. Being through the program and being on the other side and seeing how things are ran, and just the support that you get from Kent and everyone else that's part of the Torch program, it's just, my future's only going to be a lot better.
Raymond Young's future is already looking good. He's an award-winning ceramicist with work purchased by the National Gallery of Victoria.
You know, these are my markings from my mob in Gippsland, the Gunai people, and they represent 4 clans in the area that I'm related to.
As well as connecting to country, there are more practical considerations too. The Torch was launched as a pilot program, and an external assessment deemed it a success at reducing rates of reoffending.
Artists have come out of the program, long-term offenders. One fellow in particular, he said to me, you know what, everybody looks at me and says to me, you're the artist, aren't you, brother? I love those paintings of yours. He said, everyone just used to look at me and you know, there's the fellow who's always in trouble, that's the fellow and the uncle who's always in jail. But now, the community's perception of him changed. The community's perception said, oh, he's actually making art, he's exploring his culture. He started to see himself differently. He started to see himself as a man of culture and a man of art, and he was able to teach others, whereas previously he only really saw what the others saw in him, and that was a criminal.
And for the first time, prisoners taking part in the program are allowed to sell their work from behind bars. On the advice of the State Ombudsman, the Victorian government recently changed the rules to facilitate rehabilitation. Aboriginal prisoners taking part in the program will receive a portion of the money straight away, while the majority will be held in trust until their release. Interest earned on the trust accounts will be paid to victim support groups.
They can earn sufficient income to be independent so they don't re-offend. And the sad thing about the Indigenous community here in Victoria is over 50% of those who are incarcerated, Indigenous incarcerated men and women, over 50% re-offend. Now we're seeing with this program already that where we're assisting these people, where they're earning money for their outputs, it's building their confidence, and those who have left prison, there's only been 1 or 2 who have re-offended.
This is about thinking outside the square. It's not about setting targets, it's not about setting benchmarks, it's about bringing hope that Aboriginal offenders can connect to their heritage whilst serving a period of imprisonment, but importantly build their self-esteem through their culture, give them some of the life skills that are necessary that they may have missed out on earlier in their life in order to transition successfully back into the community.
The Torch is now turning its focus beyond Victoria and hopes to expand to other parts of Australia. It's hoped programs like this will help to reduce the rate of Aboriginal incarceration.
I often say we're not trying to close the gap here, it's closing the chasm. The differences are quite extreme. So Indigenous Australians make up less than 3% of the population, yet make up close to 30% of the prison population, and are 15 times more likely to be incarcerated than non-Indigenous Australians.
The road to healing is got to start from within, you know, and yeah, my art's helped me do that. So I hope that they can do the same. Yeah.
My markings, which are from Gippsland, people look at them and they say, okay, we know where this is from. So that's where I want to go down, that line and all that sort of stuff, so that people, you know, say, okay, well, that's a Ray Young piece. You know, it's pretty cool. I've never seen myself as an artist, so, you know, and it's been like 3 years now, so it's just amazing.
Stephanie Anderson in Melbourne. Hidden on the western edge of the Blue Mountains sit the Highland swamps of the Nunes Plateau. The plateau is a wilderness habitat for 2 endangered animals, the giant dragonfly and Blue Mountains water skink. The swamps face many man-made pressures like forestry, recreational vehicles and mining. Now 2 leading biologists are hoping a focus on swamp science could lead to stronger protections for the rare creatures they study. Producer Greg Miskelly and Parramatta Bureau cameraman Ross Byrne got the gumboots on to film this trip to the Nunes Plateau.
My name is Sasha Gorison. I'm a 3rd year PhD student at the University of Sydney in the Shine Herpetology Lab, which means research of amphibians and reptiles. The basis of an ecological project is field work. You have to get out there in nature and figure it out. That's exactly what attracted me to this project. I'd previously worked in medicine on neurobiology and neuroscience, and I noticed myself as I was measuring samples, I would be staring out the window thinking, how do I get outside? Today I walked out into the swamp with a bag of traps, and one by one we put them out. We made a hole in the dense vegetation to insert the trap into. The lizard is a diurnal species, meaning is active in the daytime. We want to set traps on the first day as close to sunset as possible. We check traps every evening for those 3 days.
My name is Baird, and I have been studying giant dragonflies, petalura dragonflies. What we call the giant dragonfly, which is also known as the southeastern petal tail, and they're peat swamp habitats since 2003. So I've spent a lot of time in these peat swamps in the Blue Mountains. When you just scan your eyes over them, it looks like this layer of sedgy heathland. And immediately you start walking in there, you realise that this is a very complex environment. There's tunnels and burrows everywhere, there's swamp rats tunnelling through just above the water level, there's crayfish burrows everywhere.
We found the remnants of a crayfish, one of the species that lives here. It's an ecosystem engineer in the swamps. The crayfish make the burrows, then the lizards can use them to escape predation and fire.
I'm pretty sure these two burrows here, in fact I'm very sure, are giant dragonfly burrows. One of the interesting things about this family of dragonflies is that all of them breed and complete their larval lives in peat swamp type habitats. It's pretty windy today, and they normally don't like flying when it's windy, so they're normally just perched down low in the sedges. But if we get a break in the wind, then they can often start getting active again.
What's that over there then?
That's one. That's a male. He appears to have personality to us. They're feisty creatures. They're big, they're strong flyers, they're robust, and they interact robustly. We just saw a female, which just by its coloration and the fact that it was not flying away quickly, it was obviously just emerged from its larval skin. So the larvae this morning just crawled up out of its burrow, crawled up in the sedges. And this is, I'm very confident, this is the larval skin from the individual we just saw. In the last couple of years, a global genetic study was done across the family. The results of that work suggest that most of the species haven't changed since about 150 million years ago in the mid-Jurassic. That's a very, very long time for an animal to remain as a distinct lineage genetically.
1, 2, 3. No,
no snakes.
It's light, I don't see a snake. I do see something
Jiggly.
very cute though. Cool. We've got 2 Blue Mountains water skinks.
Sasha and I have been collaborating on stuff and working in swamps together since she started her PhD fieldwork. In fact, before she started her PhD fieldwork. Okay, S2.
When we recapture a skink, we tend to capture it in the same trap, and the traps are around 10 metres apart, so we're estimating a home range at about 10 metres. For the lizard, it's paramount that it's in a waterlogged environment with dense understory and opportunities to bask in the sun. When we started this study, we weren't sure if the skink only lived in the swamps or in the surrounding habitats as well. So when we set traps, we found out that 95% of the skinks we find are in the swamp proper itself. The lineage of the Blue Mountains water skink is around 2 million years old. The key threatening processes for this species are climate change, inappropriate fire regimes, impacts from longwall mining.
The precautionary principle has been given lip service for a long time. I think the evidence from elsewhere in the Sydney Basin is that when the groundwater goes, all of the species that are dependent on the groundwater will go.
Over the course of 3 years, we caught around 450 to 500 skinks. So knowing this, we've realised that our conservation message to management authorities is to protect this skink, we need to protect the habitat. I'm in love with swamps. I understand that if people see them, it doesn't look like much, it's a boggy area, but I know the secrets, I know what's in there. I know about 2 amazing threatened species that live there that need a helping hand.
You can find more about the Newlands Plateau debate, including industry and activist views, on the ABC News website. Working in the field of child protection is confronting at the best of times, even more so when you're dealing with the victims of conflict. Brisbane-born child protection specialist Anthony Nolan is working in Africa's South Sudan, where boys as young as 11 have been fighting a bloody and protracted war. While the conflict continues, humanitarian groups are desperately trying to secure the release of child soldiers. David Lewis caught up with Anthony Nolan, who is playing a pivotal role in those negotiations.
It's a cliche, but this work is really rewarding. And you meet these extraordinary children who have been through the most extraordinary circumstances.
My name is Anthony. Yeah, what's your name?
Child protection specialist Anthony Nolan has worked all over the world, but nothing could have prepared him for his latest posting in South Sudan.
So since 2011, when the country became independent, there was a huge amount of optimism about the future of the country. And there was a couple of years of relative peace, and then there was a disagreement between the president and the vice president, who essentially then are now at war with each other. The conflict has been pretty brutal. Huge numbers of children and women were killed, injured, many were raped, and we even had reports of people being thrown into burning buildings, thrown in alive.
UNICEF estimates up to 16,000 children have been recruited to fight since the civil war erupted.
These children are learning to use weapons, and they're learning to kill, essentially. A lot of them received instructions on what to do when they arrive in a village. Some of the boys we've spoken to told us about how they were asked to target other children because these are going to be the future fighters that may come back and retaliate. Probably the most striking case for me was a young boy who had a bullet lodged in his neck. And so we actually brought him to the hospital in the capital city where he was able to have that removed. And now he's back home living with his family.
Anthony Nolan longs to return to his family too. His work takes a toll.
Every time I get a break, I come home. I've got family here. I've got nieces and nephews who are young and growing up, and that for me is very important to keep that sense of normality and connection to my family and friends here. One of the things that I find so positive about Australia is that we are very much engaged in global discussions and global issues. And I think that we are doing an extraordinary amount, certainly punching above our weight in the international arena to make sure that we are helping these people. One of the most positive things for us has been that around 1,755 children were released by one of the armed groups. And that was a result of a long process of advocacy and negotiation with the leader of that armed group and also with the government and the armed forces.
UNICEF must now restore a sense of normality to their lives, which have been anything but normal.
We will try our best to provide you learning opportunities.
The children would tell us all sorts of stories about when they were walking for days, often without food, and they really just wanted to go home. And I think what's been so striking for me is that they're really kids. They talk about wanting to go back to school, and they talked about missing their families, missing their friends. And for them, the going home has been incredibly positive for those children.
All of the boys have truly extraordinary stories. But one of the cases that we're following very closely at the moment is a 15-year-old boy. He's the only child that's left in the interim care centre because he lost both of his parents during the conflict, was living with an uncle who can't provide for him anymore, and in fact that was one of the reasons that he joined the Cobra faction.
So which one is your bed?
There.
Okay. The release is really just the beginning. For the next couple of years, we have to ensure that those children return back to school.
Okay, so we have to get you back to people quickly so you can go back to school. Okay.
According to UNICEF, the conflict has displaced or orphaned more than 750,000 children. The pressure on aid groups is immense, but with the focus so heavily on Syria, South Sudan is often overlooked.
The scale of the conflict in South Sudan has resulted in essentially what is one of the world's biggest humanitarian crises. There's huge levels of malnutrition across the country. Huge numbers of people are moving and are fleeing conflict and moving into new areas where they don't have any more livelihoods.
There's no solution in sight in South Sudan, but Anthony Nolan is undeterred.
I think it's very easy to fall into that trap of thinking that it's hopeless. But what we also see in South Sudan, and particularly what we saw this year when those children were released, is that there are positive things that can happen. And people are able to do extraordinary things when they're facing these most dire situations. So there is hope. And what we now need is for the peace deal to hold and for the conflict to stop.
David Lewis with that report. The Dean of Hobart's Anglican Cathedral is into deep purple. Not just the ecclesiastical colour, but also the band. Before life as a clergyman, the Very Reverend Richard Humphrey was a roadie, and in his downtime he likes nothing more than listening to a bit of progressive rock. His unusual musical tastes haven't always connected with parishioners, but his passion for popular culture has helped him spread the word far and wide. Peter Carline has this report.
It's a typical Sunday morning for the Very Reverend Richard Humphrey and his congregation at St David's Anglican Cathedral in Hobart. Well, almost typical.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Happy Valentine's Day.
Rich and I met when I was 15 and he was 17, and we actually spent our first time together at a music festival in England.
While the church and his family may be his highest calling, also close to the heart of the Reverend Richard Humphrey is something a little less celestial. He's a progressive rock tragic from way back. Inspired as a Tasmanian teenager by Deep Purple. And later Genesis. And Jethro Tull. Since becoming Dean 7 years ago, Mr Humphrey is projecting that love of music from the pulpit.
Sometimes they don't work. When I was first at St David's, my congregation was not young or large. I was preaching about generosity, and I said, so as the Red Hot Chili Peppers told us, we should give it away, give it away, give it away now. Give it away, give it away, give it away now. And there was utter silence. Give it away, give it away, give it away now. It was like a tumbleweed moment in a Western.
He brings a lot of comedy and laughter and inclusiveness. He's not a stuffed shirt by any means.
I think he's actually really worked hard to try and bring the extremes of the church together.
He may be unorthodox, but the odd lost in translation moment hasn't deterred. This chicken dance was in support of a fundraiser for a Kenyan chicken farm. Last Christmas, the Reverend Richard Humphrey introduced a Star Wars series of sermons to coincide with the latest blockbuster.
Somebody just said, in a Galilee far, far away, and we went, that will work.
Blue typeface letters came on the screen with those words, and then bum, 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 bum.
It was an instant and unprecedented hit.
our posts on Facebook may get maybe 3,000 views. This had 50,000 views. We had people sharing it around the world. We've had emails from Finland, Hungary, Uganda.
The Humphrey home, meanwhile, is a temple to all things rock.
So I have about 10,000 LPs, CDs, DVDs, singles and so on, and covering a wide variety. This is my Christian music set, which may not be as popular as some of the others, but this is the artist that I used to tour with, and my name is on the credits of this properly, although they misspelt my name. But that happens to us all, I guess, at times.
That's right, Reverend Humphrey was once a tour manager for Welsh singer-songwriter Martin Joseph.
From Newport Beach up to Big Sur.
And he played in a band in Sydney in the 1990s. They were called Trevor's Fridge.
It was actually part of the Chinese Presbyterian Church, and I'm neither Chinese nor Presbyterian, but it was fun to be part of.
Every time he moves into a room, he turns the music on, and then he will leave it on, so I go around the house turning the music off to get a bit of peace and quiet.
Mr. Humphrey's life may have taken a different turn, but he hasn't lost it.
Occasionally still get to play guitar, although guitar and robes is not a good look unless you're going for Queen 1975. But it's a great joy to do a job that you love and use the gifts and skills that people tell me that I'm good at.
The Dean's teenage sons are also discovering the power of music.
I've definitely started doing a lot of theatre, which has really been influenced by his massive, a passion for music. I also play guitar because of him, and I also do a lot of singing because of him. I'm very into programming because of him as well. But when it comes around to music, I usually like electro and techno rather than his old prog rock.
Well, you can't win them all. And just like his record collection, the very Reverend Richard Humphrey's popularity continues to grow.
I don't like striped shirts, Andrew. Peace be with you. Oh, peace be with you. Thank you so much.
I hope more importantly, not just people think we have a sense of humour, but will understand that we were talking about not war, but peace, and that in a Galilee far, far away, our Saviour did come.
Peter Carline reporting there. I hope you've enjoyed this week's show. You can catch any of our stories again on iView or on our website. And we look forward to you joining us again next week for Australia Wide.